Good morning. Welcome to the Reuther-Pollack Labor History Symposium number 5. And I'm going to introduce our second speaker for the day. And just a reminder, we'll have a break when the speaker finishes, and then we'll resume with the afternoon session at 2 p.m. Our second speaker is Dr. Dana Caldemeyer, who came all the way from Georgia to be with us today. She is an assistant professor of history at South Georgia State College. Her research involves rural industrialization, labor, and capitalism. Her new book is called Union Renegades: Miners, Capitalism, and Organizing in the Gilded Age. Here is Dana Caldemeyer.
Give me a second to get situated here. How y'all doing? Good. All right. Well, like he said, my name is Dana Caldemeyer, and is there feedback going on? My name is Dana Caldemeyer, and I'm an associate professor of history at South Georgia State College. And my book, as you can see, is Union Renegades. And it's basically an examination of the social and economic reasons for workers deciding to either not join the union or perhaps to join the union and then say, well, I don't want to follow these particular union orders, or, I'm done with the union, I'm going to leave it. And so that's really who the Union Renegades are. They're these people who have some interest in the union, but then never quite stick to union principles, as union organizers would say. And this book really kind of got started whenever I was a PhD student, and I was reading through labor organizer papers from the Gilded Age. And over again, I kept on seeing reports from organizers who were on the ground trying to organize workers. And they kept saying, I'm just having a really hard time getting these guys into the union. They keep on coming to the talks. They're here and they seem to be listening. They seem to be nodding along. And then nobody signs up for the union, or they join and then 2 weeks later they leave. And I can't figure this out. And I kept on seeing more and more of these. And every now and again, you'd start to see organizers' reasons for why, trying to kind of rationalize what was going on. And a lot of those reasons kept on circling back to the workers themselves. The organizers saying, well, these workers, they just don't get the power of unionism. They don't understand that the union is here for them. They just don't know what's good for them. They're working against their interest. And at the time, I didn't think a whole lot of it because, I was just, an introductory student. Oh, okay, that's why. And I thought that was kind of strange, that there weren't very many perspectives from the workers that I had seen so far, and especially not in the historical literature. And so that was just kind of an odd thing that kind of sat in the back of my head. But it just so happened that at the time that I was doing those, that intensive reading into organizer reports, I was also reading newspapers from the present day about the current labor situation, where people weren't joining in with the union on today's time period. And I was reading through all these political pundits, and they were kind of talking about, why are these guys not joining up with the union? And I can't figure out why they're voting this way. And then it got to something really familiar to me. Well, they just don't know what the power of the union is. They don't know that what's good for them. They're acting against their interest. And I said, oh, wait a minute. This might be something interesting. And so I decided to kind of dive into the 19th century labor movement, because one of the things that I kept hearing from the present day was that, if we could just have workers from today's time period have the kind of spirit that they had back in the Gilded Age whenever everybody was super into the union, then we'd be set. And I knew one thing. I didn't know much, but I knew one thing. I knew that organizers back then were complaining about the exact same things that we were facing today. And so that's really where this project began. And so that's what I wanted to focus on. And I decided to focus on a region that was a little bit unusual. I hope I can get this to work. Yeah, there we go. I knew that I wanted to look at the coal industry because the coal industry had a long history of labor organizing. And it really seemed as though if anybody was going to be able to get their workers into a union, it was going to be something like the United Mine Workers, which had a really strong going, basically, at least on paper, from the time it formed in the 1890s. And I looked in particular at the Midwestern region. I know most of y'all are really familiar with the Appalachian region of coal. A lot of histories have been written on that. And I can't tell you how many times I've been in a research library and I said, oh, I'm doing research on coal. And they bring me all the books on Appalachia. And I said, oh, no, I'm not doing Appalachian coal, I'm doing Midwestern coal. And they say, I didn't know there was coal in the Midwest. And so this is my map to show you know there is coal there. And they were mining it in the 19th century. And the really cool thing about the Midwestern coal industry, and one of the key reasons why I decided to focus on it was because that the Midwest had this really rich history of organizing already. They had been mining in this region for a good while. I focus on the mines in Indiana, Illinois, Western Kentucky, Iowa, Missouri, and then Kansas, and a little bit of what back then would have been called Indian Territory. And so that's really where I was focusing on. And it just so happened that these guys were very into unions even before the United Mine Workers had formed. Southern Illinois, a little town called Belleville, had actually been the very first attempt for miners to form a national coal union. And they had done that in really the mid-1800s. Now, it didn't last very long. They weren't very successful, but that was where they tried first. And so I knew that was there, but then you also have a whole bunch of labor leaders that are also coming out of this time period. Dan McLaughlin, Richard Travelick, they were both really big names in the labor movement. And then, of course, Eugene Debs came out of the Indiana coal fields as well. And so there was all this legacy of labor organizing. And on top of that, in the really the late part of the 1800s, especially into the 1890s, you see a lot of political movements taking place in the United States. Third-party movements where farmers and laborers are really upset with just how things are going. There's a depression going on and they're really frustrated. And so they start voting for third-party movements. And one of the things that you see is it really taking hold in the Midwest, and overwhelmingly the people in the coal fields were the ones who were voting for these third-party movements, supposed to be for the workers. So here I figured, well, if there's going to be a place for the workers to organize and to see the power of unionism, it's going to be in this place right here. And you do see more thorough organizing in the Midwest than you did in the Appalachian coal fields in the 1880s and 1890s. But they still had a hard time keeping members in the union. They had all kinds of trouble. Illinois had about 30,000 miners working in the entire state, which is teeny tiny compared to what's going on in Appalachia at the time. But they were supposed to be thoroughly organized. They were supposed to know the value of organizing. And the organizers, they couldn't ever get more than 3,000 people max in the union for the entire state. And of course, these organizers are upset by this, and they can't figure this out. And so this is going to be really the thing that my book really focuses on. Why aren't these people in the union? Why won't they join? And so that's where I started. I really wanted to make sure that I told the story from the workers' perspective. There are all kinds of fantastic books that already exist that talk about corporate culture and how corporations really stamp out unions, and how governments really had harsh laws that attacked workers in the Gilded Age. And those are absolutely true for the cases here. But whenever I was doing my research, I really wanted to see from the workers themselves why they weren't joining the union. And what I found was they were happy to explain why they didn't want to join the union, but they never mentioned corporations telling them not to join, so they decided to follow what their boss said. And they never cited any sort of government laws to say, well, this law is why I didn't join. They gave other reasons. So what I did was I basically did a whole deep dive into 19th century newspapers. Workers back then wrote letters to editors and wrote letters to governors and wrote letters to mayors talking about their problems. And I looked for anything from a worker that basically explained any sort of frustration that they had. And a really cool thing in the Gilded Age, at least for a very brief window, labor papers were willing to print just about anything that came across into their mail. So even the United Mine Workers, they were having a really tough go of things whenever they first formed, but they still insisted on even printing the letters that were critical toward them. And they didn't hold anything back. They really just went all out saying, I hate this and I hate this about the United Mine Workers. And they're printing it in the United Mine Workers Journal. So that to me was my treasure trove. And so I spent years kind of digging through a whole bunch of letters that were written by workers explaining why they didn't want to join the union, or why they did join and decided to leave, or why they remained in the union but refused to pay dues. And so that's really what I'm focusing on in my book. So let's talk about some of my findings. It's fun, right? All right. So what I did find was that workers were very aware of their problems. They understood a whole bunch of the economic and the governmental problems that really put them in the situation that they face. They didn't have to look hard for that. They didn't need somebody to tell them that. Take a look at this. It's one of my favorite pictures. This is an entire palace that is gilded out of coal. And you could find these in the Midwest, not in every single coal town, but you could find them because this is how the towns really kind of brag to everybody. Look at what we got here. We have so much coal that we can build buildings out of it. All right, so this is bragging rights in the Gilded Age. The Gilded Age is a time period whenever everybody really wants to show off their stuff. They don't always want to pay for it, but they want to show off whatever they can. And so the Coal Palace is one of those places where you really see them just kind of showing off the wealth that their community has to basically present. And you saw these all over the place. There's one story that I found in Kansas where this poor miner had been contracted to basically dig out a huge block of coal that was going to be put on display in the town's hotel, just as a decoration, very similar to this. Yeah, I know. it's the Gilded Age. And so they're going to like bring out this coal, and the whole premise of this is that the coal has to stay intact because everybody's seen a pile of just small lumps of coal and nobody cares about that. We want a pristine giant block. And so they promised this guy $11 if he will. That was decent money back then. Not super decent, but he would do okay with that. If he could get that whole thing out of the ground intact, he could get $11. He would split with his helper that was going to help him hoist it and mine it out. And then they would also give him money to buy some beer for the people that would help him get it out of the shaft and to the hotel. And so the miner says, deal, I'll do it. And so he delivers on his end of the bargain. He gets the block to the hotel. The hotel does not give him the $11, and they do not give him the money for the beer. And you know that he feels angry about this, but he also feels terrible because he had promised people things. He knew that other people had been promised. And so he decided that what little money they gave him was around $5, I think. He split that $5 with the person who helped him hoist out the coal. And then he took the remaining money and he purchased the beer. So he came away with nothing. You don't have to tell a person like that they're being robbed. They know that on their own. And so that's what I saw whenever I was going through these newspapers. It was all kinds of stories just like that. But here's the thing, whenever you see these displays for coal and bragging rights and everything, there's a different side to the whole coal story too. The whole premise behind coal's value is that it's not worth very much at all because they needed that coal to be super, super cheap. They needed that coal to be able to not be worth much so that they could send it off to wherever they needed to send it to. Coal is basically one of the things that you need to make just about anything in the industrial age. And people wanted to keep their production costs low. And so the only way that you could do that is if raw materials like coal were extremely cheap. And Coal operators understood this very well in the Gilded Age, because by the time you get to the 1880s and 1890s, railroads have spanned the entire United States. So that, previously, if you were in Chicago and you had a demand for coal, you could go to the Northern Illinois mines. They regularly supplied the Chicago coal market. But by the time you really get the railroads connecting small towns throughout the country to just about anywhere else, all of a sudden, those Northern Illinois coal miners aren't the only ones who can supply coal to Chicago. Now, miners in Southern Illinois can. Miners in Ohio, miners in West Virginia, anybody who can mine coal and has access to a railroad, they can ship coal to the Chicago market. And what you see then is a bidding war. A race basically to the bottom to have the lowest coal, the cheapest coal, because the coal companies understood that if they could make their coal cheaper, then they would be able to get more contracts and they would be able to make more of a profit. But where are you going to cut those costs? You're going to cut them with the workers. You're going to cut them with safety standards and things like that. So mines became even more dangerous and wages continued to reduce. And so the miners have a front row seat for all this, and they understand that they are competing with mines across the country. That's why they're talking about forming a national union over and over again. They understand that this is the only way that they're ever going to be able to stop what's happening here. They understand that their coal company that they work for is competing against a whole bunch of other coal companies that they've never met. And the only way that they can do that is if they are all on the same page at once. It's a great idea in theory, but it's really, really hard to do in real life. And basically, throughout the 1880s, you see these efforts to try to get a national labor union together. And they're constantly trying to merge these different organizations into one great big national structure. And bless you, nothing really sticks until really the 1890s, whenever the United Mine Workers forms. And there's a whole bunch of other smaller unions that kind of join together in this big hope that maybe if they could finally just unite, then they would be strong enough to take on the major coal markets that kept on lowering their wages. And so this is basically the whole purpose behind the United Mine Workers. They tried a new structure that hadn't really been implemented before. It was basically this effort to centralize the organization, basically make it so that a national board would be able to have complete control over all strike situations, over wage contracts and things like that. They would set what a miner could work for and what a miner could not work for. And if the miners had a problem with something, they had to get the approval of the national board before they could go and strike. And the thought process behind this was that they needed somebody, a board of people that could go toe-to-toe with the coal companies and could go toe-to-toe with the railroads. And those previous models where the miners had been involved in the past, they really didn't have that. Local miners and local unions really were pretty autonomous. They had national structures, they had national leadership, but those people didn't have a whole lot of power. They didn't get the chance to say when a strike was valid or when it wasn't. The United Mine Workers gave itself that power whenever they formed. And the thought process was, this is going to be how we are able to keep everybody on the same page. If everything comes out of the central office here, then we can dictate when strikes happen and when they don't happen, and we'll make sure that we'll only strike whenever we're ready to. And that's the thought. Whenever the United Mine Workers was formed, it was kind of understood that this was going to be it. This was going to be the ticket to the miners' salvation. They said this over and over again. They had this vision in mind of what they were going to achieve, but they also knew that it was going to take a little bit before they got there. But the trouble was that for a lot of these organizers, they kept this focus on what they were building, what they were going to get to. And for a lot of the workers on the ground, they see this potential. They understand the long game that these guys are playing for. But they're the ones that are getting their wages reduced. They're the ones who have to figure out how they're going to pay for bills and pay for union dues, all while the union is saying, well, we're going to be doing something in the future. And so I did a really deep dive into this, trying to figure out what the workers thought about this new structure, what the workers thought about just the union dynamics in general. And what I found was that the workers looked at the union very, very differently from how a lot of organizers did. A lot of organizers, whenever they organized and whenever they joined the union themselves, they were doing it for the long haul. I'm here for the greater good. I'm here to make sure that we're building a movement that we can pass forward, that's strong, and that will be able to, really take control over the coal industry and make sure that workers get a fair wage. The workers didn't see it like that all the time. Some of them did, but not all of them. A lot of workers instead saw the coal unions as a tool, one of many tools, something that they could use in a moment whenever they needed it, but then they could put it down and grab a different tool whenever they needed a different tool for whatever problem that they faced. Basically, the union was good whenever they had a need for it, but it wasn't something that was necessary to have a continued commitment to if they didn't really need it in the moment. And this was a thing that a lot of organizers just couldn't wrap their heads around, because of course the union's never going to be useful if you can't be in it all the time. How are you going to build a movement if you don't have people there to make things move? But the workers didn't always see it that way. So let's make sure I'm doing okay on some time here. Couple of things that I found as far as why workers might not have wanted to join the union really had to do with a lot of just their daily lives. These are things that we don't really think twice about sometimes today. We're used to people only having one occupation. I'm a college professor. That's what I do. Don't really do anything else for any other money. You might have somebody who's a doctor or a lawyer, and that's the job that they work. In the 19th century, though, that's not always the case, especially in rural America. You might have somebody who's a farmer, but he also might mine some coal on the side. Or you might have a coal miner and he works as a farm laborer on the side. So you actually have people who are working multiple occupations. And that might not sound like very much, but it actually meant a lot to the people on the ground there. Because this was a common dynamic that you saw in mining communities throughout the United States. And it kind of makes sense if you think about it. The demand for coal is always going to be highest in the winter because people need extra coal to heat their businesses, heat their homes, and things like that. In the summertime, you'd see mines that would only run half time in some places because the demand just wasn't there. So for a lot of miners in the summertime, well, it just so happens to be the exact same time whenever farm demand starts to pick up. Of course, they're going to go and earn a little bit of extra cash at the farm down the road. And then, of course, the reverse is also true for farmers. There's not a whole lot to do on most farms in the winter months at the exact same time that demand for coal is going up. And so this was kind of a symbiotic relationship, at least at first. But as we got closer and closer to this agrarian crisis where farmers really weren't earning nearly as much money as they had been in the past, you start to see them becoming more and more desperate and entering into the mines to kind of make up for the money that they weren't earning in their farm profits. And that's where the union kind of gets involved, because technically these farmers are miners, but they would say, well, I'm not going to pay dues to the UMW in May whenever I don't mine coal. Oh, yeah. Why should I pay into a organization that I'm not even a miner for most of the time? I don't have any need for that. And it gets worse from there. In the winter months, that's whenever coal miners expected to make the most pay. They actually earned more money per ton mining coal in the winter than they did during the summer months in a lot of cases. And so whenever they found out in several instances that they weren't going to get that winter pay increase, and in fact, they were going to get a wage decrease, they're ready to strike. But for farmers, they say, it's just a supplemental income for me. I get most of my money from the farms. I don't need to go on strike for higher wages. I'll take this. I just need a little bit of money. I'll just continue to work. If you go on strike, I'm going to break your strike. Or what really got organizers upset, the farmers saying, all right, I won't strike, but you got to pay me the strike aid. Because they're miners. They mine in the winter. And so if they are going on strike, then they would say, I'm entitled to that strike aid. And of course, the unions have very, very limited funds whenever it comes to the strike aid. And so this is something that organizers would just kind of shake their fists at, saying, well, how can we deal with this issue? The farmers are constantly causing us problem. And the farmers would say, yeah, but I'm a miner too, just not a miner all the time. And so it's dynamics like this that make things really, really complicated. Technically, the farmers would say, yeah, I'm a union. I join the union whenever I need to. I just don't need to join it in May. And I don't need to join it whenever you guys are striking because I'm okay with the decreased wages as they go. But if we ever see ourselves in a really bad situation, then I'll totally strike with you. The organizers say, well, this does me no good. This does me no good at all. And so these are the kind of dynamics that I found whenever I was doing this dive into workers' frustration with the union. Another one that I found was the actual problem that workers had with the national structure of the United Mine Workers. And the best case that I have to really show this to you is what happened in 1891. It's just a couple months really after the United Mine Workers had formed, they announced that they were going to have the nationwide coal strike, the strike that people had been talking about that they were going to do once they had a national union. And miners who had been in the union for decades at this point, not the United Mine Workers, but the ones that existed before, they knew exactly what this meant. Now is the time whenever we're going to be strong and we're going to be firm and we're going to get the 8-hour day, we're going to get better wages, we're going to have safer working conditions. This is the beginning. And of course, the Midwest, which had been organized for a while, they are beside themselves excited. They cannot wait for this. And a couple days before the national strike was supposed to start, the national board said, we're not going to do it. Strike's canceled. Everybody go back to work like normal. What? And the union said, we're not strong enough right now. Yeah, you think that you're strong because your neighborhood is thoroughly organized. But West Virginia, they refuse to have anything to do with the union. Eastern Ohio, forget about it. We can't strike unless everybody's on board. So you're just going to have to sit tight until we get a little bit stronger. For the people who have been paying dues for months, waiting for this big moment, for nothing. So they were annoyed. At first, angry, some of them. Some of them actually did not hear about the strike cancellation until they walked out thinking that the rest of the nation was going with them. Terrible communication in the Gilded Age. And so they didn't get that memo and they ended up striking anyway, only to find out that now they were striking against the union and they weren't entitled to any strike aid. And then they were really angry. But they said that they understood. You know, like, I guess it makes sense. Maybe the union miscalculated. Somebody made some bad decisions somewhere, some people said. But I get it. Whatever. We'll stay with the union. In Indiana, the miners stuck with the union all the way until November of 1891. And then they found out that they were going to get another wage reduction. Now, this had been a wage reduction that had been left over from whenever they didn't strike last May, and it actually cascaded forward, so they were going to face another one because it seemed like as far as the corporations were concerned, nothing was stopping them. And so the miners, whenever they find out about this, they say, I can't afford to live on this new wage reduction. There is no way that I will be able to make ends meet with this. We have to strike. And so they wrote to the national board, and they said, hey, you have got to honor the strike. The United Mine Workers said, no, if you go on strike, you're not going to get the support of the United Mine Workers. You're going to have to just go on strike on your own. You're not going to get any strike aid. And the miners said, but we paid dues to you. We paid dues to the strike fund. What do you mean? And the United Mine Workers said, well, we actually gave that money to Pennsylvania strikers, and they're not doing so great. But if you could keep going to work, don't strike, and keep going to work and send what money you can to the striking miners in Pennsylvania. Curious thing, the striking miners in Pennsylvania were actually working for more money than what they were working for more money and striking for even more money than anything that the miners in Indiana were looking at. So not only can they not afford to live, they're supposed to send whatever spare money they have to striking people somewhere that they hadn't even met. This is what gets them angry. And that got them so angry that the state organizer for the United Mine Workers said, basically, you know what, this is ridiculous. We've been sidetracked long enough. It's time for us to act against the union. And so they actually became the union renegades in this case. They decided that they were going to go on strike for higher wages, even though the union told them not to. They actually got a little bit out of it. They didn't get their full gains, but they did end up with a little bit of a pay increase. But they were done with the United Mine Workers after that. Even though they had won their strike, at least on paper, they had gotten a few gains. The United Mine Workers hadn't helped them at all, and they said, you know what, we're done with you. And what they did was they left the United Mine Workers, and they formed their own local unions that were against national orders. They said, you know what, we're going to pay dues into a local union, and we're going to keep all that money here so that if we ever run into problems again, then we'll have that money ready for us. Because we probably could have won if we would have had a larger strike fund, but we didn't have anything. The problem, at least from the miners' perspective, was that this national organization that was running the United Mine Workers wasn't looking after everybody's interests. The miners in the Midwest felt that they were being overlooked and always sidetracked compared to like Pennsylvania or in some places in Ohio. And so for a lot of miners, they did firmly believe in organization, but they didn't think that a national organization was something that really helped them personally. And so these are the kinds of things that I really look at in my work here. I have a couple pictures here to kind of help you guys visualize the kind of mines that I'm talking about here. These aren't great big production mines or anything like that. These are things that people basically do in their backyards. This is one from Illinois. Here's one from Kansas. A little ramshackle, don't look terribly safe. These are the kinds of things that the workers are working in. These are the kinds of things that that they're investing in some cases. In some cases, this is another reason why workers might not have joined the union. Miners and farmers sometimes own stock in the coal mines themselves. These aren't great big things. There isn't any one large coal operator in some of these ramshackle businesses. Mining coal is really, really cheap. You don't have to have a whole bunch of equipment to do this in the Gilded Age. Some farmers, they just take a shovel out back and dig a hole, and that's it. They get their wife and kids to help, and then they just send whatever they can to the market. So what you see are miners. In some cases, if they have a little bit extra money, they'll purchase share in a mine, or they'll go together and purchase a mine together. And that's all well and good. That's them trying to make money for them, their families. But in doing so, they become part owners of the coal mine. What happens whenever a national union orders a nationwide coal strike? Are these guys going to strike in solidarity with the rest of the miners, or are they going to act in business interest as an owner or partial owner of the mine? They'll go to the mines. They'll break the strike every single day of the week because they can't afford to lose that investment in the mines. Organizers don't always get that. Sometimes they do. There's one organizer in Southern Illinois who spent his time trying to get Indiana miners into the union. He was constantly talking about, the power of unionism, but he was actually a mine owner in Southern Illinois, and he continually paid lower than union rates. So for miners who look at this, they say, well, what does it even mean to be in the union anyway? If I'm in the union, I pay dues, he's telling me not to strike. And then you have organizers who are also paying below union rates. You're telling me to work for lower than union rates. What's the purpose? Why should I join? And organizers say, because it's good, we're building a movement. What movement? I keep moving to get poorer. That's it. So these are the things that workers are talking about. Black workers were very upset in some instances with the union. The way that the United Mine Workers worked from the outset was that they accepted people of color into the mines. No religious differences, no rejection on any of those lines. Everybody, if you mine coal, you were in. And as far as the union was concerned, that was a job well done. That was all they needed to do. Because, of course, now since the doors are open, everybody's going to come flooding in. All the workers are just going to join the union. And black miners said, well, wait a minute. I'm still not getting treated fairly. The United Mine Workers said, no, because all miners are working for the same wages, which was true, at least on paper. Every miner worked for the same low per ton wage at a mine, regardless of race. But white miners got preferential treatment in the mines. which meant that white miners, even though they got the same per ton rate in wages, they earned a little bit more money. If they had a problem and they took a grievance to their mine operator, they could possibly, if the operator was generous, they might listen to them. They might say, no, I'm not going to listen to your request. Just go back to the mine. A black miner, if he took a grievance to an operator, he could get fired. He could get beaten up. Or in one instance, he actually got shot for talking about not getting paid his fair weight in coal. So for black miners, they understand that there is a really serious problem here that's keeping them from earning a living for their families. The United Mine Workers didn't always see that. They said, well, no, you're in the union. We're letting you in the union. We're making sure that your job is safe. What more do you want? And the black miners replied, equality. But in the Gilded Age, that's not always something that computes. Same thing goes for immigrant workers during this time period. They were seen stereotypically in the Gilded Age as people who were not fit to mine, people too stupid to mine. You could not teach them how to mine properly. All of this is completely false. But that was the stereotype. And there was actually a movement among the United Mine Workers to keep immigrant miners out of the mines. They still wanted the miners to be in the union, though. And immigrant miners said, wait a minute, why would I pay money to an organization that is spending money creating laws designed to keep me out of the mines? Why would I do that? That's really dumb. No, I'm not going to do that. And so they left. Not too terribly far from here. I'm from Georgia, so everything in the Appalachian region is close in my mind. But not too far from here, immigrant miners got gunned down for pushing for greater rights. Immigrant miners looked at the United Mine Workers and said, I want to join. I really do believe in this, but I don't feel like this organization is the best for me. And so they actually left the union, and a lot of them joined up with the Knights of Labor during this time period. They said, I just want my charter moved from the United Mine Workers to the Knights of Labor. At least they still print stuff in my native language. At least they will give me stuff that I can understand. So these are the reasons. All these things are really reasons why people would look at the union and say, I really like what you're doing here, but this just isn't for me right now. One last example. In 1894, the big strike. They finally get it together. They have been working for years. They have this whole thing going. 94, we're going to do it. We're going to go on a nationwide coal strike. Everybody is going to be out. We're going to leave at the same time. We're going to get what we demand. And this is going to be the real time whenever the United Mine Workers gets going. And everybody says, all right, yeah, let's do this. Because in 1894, there really is this intense moment. There is a really, really bad depression going on. Farmers are just really hard up. You have individuals, farmers and industrial workers who are marching to Washington, D.C. to get attention from the national government to pay attention to their concerns. You guys might know them as Coxey's Army. They're doing this in 94. The railroad workers go on strike. Eugene Debs is all over this. And so all these people are pushing together, and the United Mine Workers says, this is our moment. We're going to join in with this. And so they decide to walk out on a nationwide coal strike. Doesn't get off started the way that they had thought. The United Mine Workers thought that everybody was going to strike in unison, and it turned out that the miners said, you know what, no, I'm just going to strike whenever I feel like it. And so some of them struck right whenever the union said, others struck before, and others said, I'm going to wait until after and see how y'all are doing, and then I'm going to strike. So already from the outset, nobody's listening to what the union has to say. But they decide to go along with it. And within a couple of weeks, you do see these huge numbers. These miners are able to really shut down the nation in a lot of regions. All just pushing out coal, getting a higher coal wage. The union looks at this and says, we did it. We have a union. Everybody's in. Look at our numbers. They're all walking out. They're listening to us. We got this. If you were to talk to the workers during this time period, they'd say, this is such a great moment. Look at this. We're all striking together. We're here with the farmers. The farmers are working with us. We're working with the railroad workers. What a great moment for the worker in the United States. They're not talking about an organization doing all of this. They're talking about a moment that came from the grassroots. They don't see the UMW as the leader for this. They see the workers as finally rising up and taking charge, collective action at its purest. And they are jazzed. In places like the Midwest, they shut down things. Businesses have to close. They're working with the railroad companies, or not companies, but the railroad workers in a lot of regions. They're making a good show of things. And a couple of weeks in, the United Mine Workers surveys the situation. They realize that the Midwest isn't the only place that's mining coal. There are places throughout the United States that are still pumping out coal, and they're filling your coal contracts. We're going to have to shut this down. We have to stop before we get to the wage that we promised that we were going to get. The miners said, what? What do you mean we're stopping? We're going to take a lower wage? You told me that this was our moment. Look at all of us. We're all striking. This is the moment. If we're going to do it, this is it. And the union said, no, we gave the order. You're stopping and you're returning to work for this wage. The miners said, joke's on you. I don't take orders from you anyway. I'm still striking. And they did. For the United Mine Workers, this doesn't make any sense. They said, they gave the order, you should stop striking now and go back to work. But the miners said, I never listened to you anyway. You are not my boss. I know that I'm in the union, but I act on my own best interest. So I'm going to strike anyway. I'm going to strike with my neighbors and we're going to get what we want. Some of them actually did get higher wages. They lost them shortly after that, but in the moment they got it. And they said, well, if everybody would have kept on with the strike, we probably would have gotten more. Would they have? I don't know. But at least the people on the ground, they were convinced of it. And once again, union numbers fell. From 1895 to 1896, union numbers completely tanked. And it wasn't because the UMW had lost. They'd actually gotten wage gains. But for a lot of miners, they believed, I could do better on my own. I don't need an organization for this. And so that's really my takeaway from this book. Workers did understand collective action. They did see power in it. They just didn't see it as something useful all the time. And they didn't always see value in a union. And I think that's something that's really valuable for us to kind of learn from today. We want to understand what's going on in the labor movement and what's going on as far as political motivations of workers. And I don't have any answers for you. My husband and I talk about this all the time, and more I just shrug and say, I don't know. But I can tell you this. If you look closely at what the workers are saying, you're going to get a better idea of why they might not be interested in union organizing or why they might be voting in the ways that they are. It's not because they don't think that they can't think about what's in their best interest. Sometimes what they value more isn't what we're recognizing. And I think that's the big takeaway for this year. That's all I have for you. And I guess I can take any questions unless you guys are really hungry and you want to go to lunch. Any questions? All right. Well, thank you so much. Oh, sorry. I have a question back here.
Real quick, you kind of see a similar situation now for unions where they're kind of re-emerge after being kind of defeated for the last 40 years. Do you see analogous movements now in terms of national unions and more localized political actors kind of combating against each other, like kind of you did in the Gilded Age? And if so, to what degree are they analogous? What can we learn from this in terms of applying it to what we're dealing with now?
Well, today's system is a little bit more complex because every corporation is basically has its foot in multiple countries in a lot of places. So it's not always just a national union anymore. It might be an international union in some cases. So it's not a 1-to-1 ratio. And I'm trying to rack my brain on something that I've seen lately that has to do with local unions versus state. And I'm not really thinking of anything right now. But I have seen instances where workers have said, well, we could have earned more if we had been allowed to continue striking. And I think that would be the common thread that I would pull out of that. I don't have a solution for that. A lot of times whenever unions are making decisions, they have a whole bunch of data sets in front of them. And one would think that they are using that data to make good decisions, but I'm not privy to that. So, but at least on the ground, you see workers saying, we should be able to do more than what we're doing right now. And that's really what stands out to me.
I'm sort of reminded of the recent West Virginia teacher strike.
Oh yeah, the teacher strikes. That's a really good, because that is a lot where it was really powered from the grassroots, and it really kind of jumped even across state lines in some cases.
Yeah, the ADA Central had relatively little to do with what the teachers were doing on the.
Didn't he strike even though initially the unions wanted to strike and all back down? That's what I was thinking. That's what
Yeah, you do see. Yeah, thank you, Bob. That would be a great example of that. Yeah. Go ahead.
I don't really have a question, but I do have a statement about people in the unions. We recently hired a gentleman, and he asked me to have a union job, but he didn't want to pay the dues, didn't want to be part of the union. This past week, I had a discussion with him, and he was complaining about paying more in income tax and stuff than he ever had in his life. And I said, that's because you're working in a UAW shop and you get good wages. That's one of the things from the union. You didn't also your additional benefits.
Yeah, it can be difficult sometimes to see the benefits of unionism from some workers, and that certainly you see that from workers in the 19th century too. Individuals saying, I'm paying in dues, but I don't see what I'm getting out of this. And there certainly were in the Midwest mines that were thoroughly union organized, and they would say, well, you have a job because we've been fighting to make sure that every single person here stays on the mines. That's why you're making this money. So you see that back in the Gilded Age too.
Also, what you said about the companies, my brother interviewed for a job in an automotive company that the UAW was trying to organize. And he was told by the company that if you get UAW representation, you're going to pay so many thousands of dollars a year in dues and so on and so forth. I told my brother, take that job today because I work for the UAW. And if you're paying that much in dues, you're going to be making $300,000 a year.
You see some of that in the Gilded Age too. Not nearly as much of corporations trying to combat unions as they do today. And I actually argue in my book that that's largely because of the 1894 strike. The miners weren't able to get a lot of their wages that they were demanding, but the miners were able to show that they could strike in unison. And that's what really scared the companies. And so before that, companies, they would try to keep out the unions whenever they could. It wasn't like some happy day for labor unions. But after 1894, you see an active effort in coal companies throughout the United States to really crack down on anybody who might be even thinking about joining the union. And so that really is a dynamic that's taking place there too.
I'll need with my history and my dates, but I recently read Doris Kearns Goodwin's Leadership in Turbulent Times. One of the chapters is on Teddy Roosevelt and how he dealt with the miners' strike in Pennsylvania. Is that in this same time period?
It is in the same time period. It's a little bit later. That happens in the early 1900s. And that's really whenever the UNW kind of gets its national claim to fame and gets national attention and stuff. The stuff that I talk about is right before that, really whenever the United Mine Workers is trying to get its sea legs and figure out how they're going to navigate all that. This stuff that they're doing in the 1890s, it really does prepare them and set them up for the things that they do in the 1900s. So you're right on track.
Terrific book.
Thank you.
Wow, terrific. So thank you.
Thank you.
I just have one comment. I don't know if anybody's following the current strike at Nabisco right now.
I am.
Thank you very much. The solidarity is growing, and there is still union solidarity throughout. There's strikes in like 8 and 9 different states now, at different companies, trying to combat this with Mandelas and stuff. So we're coming back. It's just we've got to get more.
It's slow going.
About all this and why.
Yeah, it's a unique time to be organizing because we're dealing with COVID and all these things. But also, look at the gig economies right now. Things like Lyft and Uber, they're also trying to organize right now. And they're individuals very similar to what I deal with in my book, cobbling together multiple incomes. And it's sometimes very, very difficult to organize that and find a structure that can really help out those workers. And so there's so much room to grow here, and there is so much opportunity for people to work together. But sometimes that logistics stuff, it can be really hard to navigate.
One of the biggest things that everybody can do is fight with your pocketbook. You hear these things, boycott.
Mhm.
Do not buy Mandela's snack foods. Don't buy Oreos from Mexico. Don't buy any of the snack foods from Mexico. We buy with our pocketbook all the time.
Yeah.
Buy American-made products. That'll give them every time. Then putting your neighbors, your brothers, your sisters, your aunts, your uncles to work. So yeah,
It's a good solution.
it's a very good solution. The thing that they all understand is the pocketbook.
It's true. You afterwards.
Okay. Dan, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, let's do this. I have the lunches in here. So, everyone wants to go on the tour.